Welcome everyone, welcome to this Washington History Seminar, the last one for this semester. Co-sponsored, as always, by the National History Center and the History and Public Policy Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm Christian Osterman, I direct the History and Public Policy Program here, and delighted to co-chair the Washington History Seminar with Eric Arneson from George Washington University. We, as always, want to acknowledge our supporters, that is the National History Center, the AHA, but also the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, the W History Department, as well as a number of anonymous donors. Let me acknowledge and recognize Dane Kennedy, where are you? There you are, the president of the National History Center. Let me recognize Professor William Roger Lewis, the founding co-chair of this Washington History Seminar, and often turns up to chair sessions here. Let me extend a warm welcome to our featured speaker today, Professor Carruthers, who of course is an alumna of the Wilson Center, so it's wonderful to have her back. Eric will introduce her in just a minute. I'd like to announce that we have the New Spring program should have gone out and on your emails. If not, then there'll be flyers outside and, of course, invitations for each event. But we hope you will come back and join us for many of the sessions in the spring. Let me welcome also to the Washington History Seminar family, Amanda Perry. Where are you, Amanda? Back there. Who, of course, is succeeding Amanda Muniz, the assistant director who has gone on to bigger and better efforts, but of course also spoke about her book here a couple of weeks ago. Amanda, welcome. We look forward to having you be part of these sessions. And let me also say thanks to my staff, especially Peter Bierstecker all the way in the back, who helps put these sessions in place and get us all together. With that, we'll go to Eric.
Thank you, Christian. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this last seminar of the calendar year, Professor Susan L. Carruthers, who is Professor of History, focusing on the U.S. and the world at Rutgers University-Newark. And she has taught there since 2002. Over the past decade, she has held various fellowships at places such as Harvard's Charles Warren Center, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, which was here in 2010, 2011, and the Shelby Cullom Davis Center at Princeton in 2015-16. Her books include Cold War Captives, published by the University of California Press in 2009, Media After War, Palgrave Macmillan in 2011, and the book on which she will speak today, which was an absolutely terrific and fascinating read, The Good Occupation, American Soldiers and the Hazard of Peace, published by Harvard University Press this past year. So, Mr. Carruthers.
Thank you. Well, many thanks to Christian and the organizers of the Washington History Seminar for the invitation to talk here today, and thank you, Eric, for that introduction. And thank all of you for being here. I know it's a really busy and rather weary time of the year, so I appreciate your taking this hour and a half to be here this evening. I'm really delighted to be back at the Wilson Center, because it was during my time as a fellow here 5-6 years ago that I started thinking in earnest about occupation and its peculiar place in American popular and political consciousness. While in residence, I was also lucky enough to have been invited to give a talk at the Washington History Seminar. So, shades of deja vu, but not quite. Back then, the book I thought I was going to write, and the presentation I made back in, I think it was March or so of 2011, focused on dissecting the cultural construction of the trope I call the good occupation. In other words, the cluster of affirmative ideas about post-war military government that crystallized in the aftermath of World War II, continuing decades later to shape rosy visions of occupation as easy and ennobling. Now, needless to say, and I'm sure many of you in this room have written books, so you will know exactly what I'm talking about, that the book that I thought I was going to write at the beginning of the research process is not exactly the book that you see before you this evening. So although The Good Occupation is bookended by a discussion of the cultural makeover of occupation, the 350 or so pages in between are rooted in soldiers' own self-understandings of what it meant to belong to an army of occupation after World War II, derived from hundreds, thousands of letters home, diaries, photo albums, and unpublished memoirs. Now, this wasn't venture that back in 2010-11 I knew would even be possible. But as I got to the end of my year at the Wilson Center and in the years thereafter, I traveled around to about 30 different archives in about 15 different states across the country, unearthing troves of material that in the main have evaded historians' notice. So just a couple of specimens. Here's the frontispiece from Private First Class George Cronin's diary. He's a 19-year-old boy who spent a wonderful, terrible year, 1946, with the Army of Occupation in Korea. Now, this is probably the only time I'm going to mention Korea in my talk, because 45 minutes are not very many, so I'm primarily going to restrict myself to talking about the occupations of Germany and Japan. But Korea is, of course, a particularly interesting case in point. And Cronin did a lot of growing up during the year of 1946 and dutifully recorded it every single day in his diary. Or how about this? A letter home from Leo Bogard, who some of you may know. He later became a leading light in media sociology and in advertising. But in 1945, he was a 21-year-old serving with the Army of Occupation in Germany. And there he is appropriating some Nazi worker party notepaper to write back to his folks in Brooklyn with some postcards showing them where he'd been. So the book is primarily an exploration of the phenomenology of occupation and the subjectivities of its foot soldiers, few of whom sustained very rosy notions about their mission. George Cronin may have said he was hopeful and happy, but he often really wasn't, as it turned out. Now, it bears stressing at the outset that only a tiny minority of the men and women who served with the armies of occupation had either volunteered or trained for that role. Several thousand officers attended the School of Military Government, which was established at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And quickly thereafter, the Provost Marshal General's Office established a network of civil affairs training schools in about a dozen different university locations. So that was the bulk of the elite echelon of officer personnel. And then there were several hundred enlisted men who'd been tabbed as potential NCOs who attended specialized Army training programs. But the vast majority of Americans in uniform who formed the after armies, in John Hersey's phrase, remained in Europe or Asia by chance, and very often not by choice. So in my talk today, I want to set out some of the insights derived from my immersion in the musings of occupation personnel, men and women of multiple ethnicities and of every rank, as they struggled to work out what they were doing with, for, or to the populations of Germany and Japan in the aftermath of the most catastrophic war in human history. What were, in the book's subtitle, the hazards of peace? And how did the US military, at both an organizational and individual level, reckon with perils that were variously construed as moral and material, epidemiological, and ideological? So one of the most immediately striking phenomena to emerge from the letters and diaries of uniformed Americans in 1945 as war fitfully gave way to something that both did and did not yet merit the label peace, was how few reveled in positive sensations of victory. Much of my material covers the foundational phase of military government, the months immediately before and after the Axis powers' defeat. So I pick up precisely where most combat-focused histories of World War II come to a juddering full stop, as though everyone in uniform just went home the very moment Germany and Japan surrendered. That was certainly the fantasy that had kept many men and women going, but this was very, very rarely the reality. Now, the experiential texture of victory has received short shrift in the historiography of World War II, and I would say of war in general. Over the past decade or so, far more attention has been devoted to studying cultures of defeat than practices and sensations of victory. Maybe, following the old adage, it appears that if victors write history, then historians don't need to write about victors. But I would suggest otherwise. Victory, wartime's ubiquitous blank signifier, cries out for scrutiny. What multiplicity of expectations were vested in winning? And how was military triumph felt at ground level and made concrete in quotidian enactment of authority over defeated enemy populations and others liberated from Axis control? This, I would say, is an important question, because US military personnel of every rank enjoyed considerable latitude to make micro-adjudications of entitlement in the fluid conditions of war's end. Issues of what we might call transitional justice were settled not only by high policy, but also by individual determinations of who owed what to whom, who did or did not deserve to have their house, their farm, their shop looted, who should be allowed to travel and who should be immobilized. These were decisions that young men, some in their teens, some barely out of their teens, were making every day in the places that they'd occupied. So American soldiers' dispositions mattered a good deal to the shaping of new post-war orders on the ground. Now, of course, not all soldiers experienced victory in the same way. Some did indeed revel in conquest. General George S. Patton, whose diary I looked at, it lives just down the road in the Library of Congress, marked his triumphal crossing into Germany from Luxembourg in March 1945 by peeing in the Rhine. Yes, he is doing what you think he's doing in the slightly blurry photo. And then he wrote about it in his diary, savoring the delicious thrill of proprietorship over enemy territory all over again. And the marginal pew underscored the defiant insouciance of this turf-marking gesture. But more on Patton anon. For the great majority of uniformed Americans, victory was a deeply underwhelming experience. Elusive, fragmentary, deflating. Perhaps more surprisingly, many US servicemen and women in post-war Europe and Asia quickly developed an identity constructed less around notions of triumphant self-assertion than of aggrieved victimhood. A state of mind that had profound consequences for the project of post-war occupation, at the level of high policy and everyday practice alike. Why then was victory so disappointing? Well, perhaps a crushing anticlimax was the inevitable coda to long years of mobilization. By the spring of 1945, victory had been too long fermented in the imagination, and rumors of enemy surrender too frequent. What we might call fake news of Germany's surrender punctuated the spring of 1945 with hopes raised serially only to be dashed again. And something similar would happen in the Pacific later that summer. Also, for soldiers of a liberal sensibility, the Third Reich's downfall was cruelly overshadowed by FDR's death on April the 12th. This was a culminating achievement he ought to have lived to see, a moment whose luster was dulled by an absence as unexpected as it was lamented. And of course, the Wehrmacht's defeat was also darkened by the ongoing war in Asia, which left many American soldiers in Europe wondering whether, or how soon, they might be boarding ships and sailing not home, but sailing for the Pacific. Not in the first instance as occupation troops, but as combat units. So victory seemed marked by a series of temporal deferrals and geographic displacements, something that was surely more tangible and more fittingly euphoric elsewhere. How could American men and women serving overseas not wonder what civilians back home were doing to favour the occasion? And how could they help but suppose that somewhere else, in towns and cities across America, the party to end all parties was surely being held, celebrated in the absence of those whose sacrifices had done most to secure it. In the imagination, victory was often conjured as something tangible, a parade, a trophy to be held aloft and claimed irrevocably. But for many US soldiers, the war's end and its immediate aftermath frustrated expectations of finality and concreteness. Peace, it turned out, was something that could be lost, a perishable asset. In practice, victory was not an absolute state, but a relational phenomenon, something experienced not in isolation, but through encounters with the vanquished. Now, these intimate encounters took a variety of forms, and they were susceptible, quite understandably, to divergent interpretation. Americans eager for affirmation of moral victory scrutinized Germans, and later Japanese, for evidence that the enemy populations knew themselves to be beaten, if not necessarily contrite. So a lot of time was spent by American personnel trying to decipher the expressions of the Germans that they encountered. Or what did these faces divulge or conceal as they encountered massed ranks of Wehrmacht personnel in PW enclosures like this one? They spent a lot of time writing home or writing in their diaries, trying to figure out what often blank faces might mean, and of course no faces were scrutinized more intensely, and often with more deeper, more agitated concern than the faces of Germans in towns and villages in the vicinity of newly liberated concentration camps in Germany. So in many towns and villages, at the express order of Eisenhower himself, Germans who lived near camps were forcibly made to tour them. I'm sure all of you in this room know this very well. And a lot of the soldiers whose letters and diaries I wrote talked about these moments. They themselves had just been in the camps, and they wrote about that experience too. But they desperately wanted to know what Germans might be thinking, and were often frustrated by what they perceived as blank looks, faces that were indecipherable, or sometimes outright defiant. Faces didn't yield signs of the kind of moral awareness that they would have liked to see. Now, in Japan, Americans confronted a different conundrum. Not signs of what seemed to be sullen truculence, but unexpected manifestations of friendliness and courtesy. Astonished Wax wrote home that Japanese children were making V signs and even blowing kisses at the incoming occupation forces. Primed to interpret Japanese through orientalizing lenses as both thoroughly inscrutable and invariably sneaky, many refused to take signs of amiability at face value. One naval lieutenant, Harry McMasters, wrote home to his wife, "They are too ingratiating. They bow and smile and salute too much. It is a mask. It's not possible for any people who've been fed the propaganda of hate against us that they have been for the last 4 years to execute such an about face as on the surface they appear to have done. I mistrust them increasingly. Through an experience with them, I was taken in for the first week or so, and I have no doubt that many of us here have been. But I'm beginning to see through them. As for the blown kisses and V signs, well, surely this behavior attested how thoroughly indoctrinated and obedient to authority the Japanese population was. with even young infants drilled to put on a show of deference for the occupiers. This apparent guilelessness was also suspect. Some Americans sought assurance of victory through direct acts of dominance. Perhaps the most frequent and pointed such occasions for enlisted men occurred in the act of appropriating homes for billets. Grim pleasure could be gleaned from turfing Germans out of their houses, relegating them to cellars, outhouses, or the streets, and laying claim to creature comforts that former occupants had still so recently enjoyed. Now we are leading the life of conquerors. That phrase, or some version of that phrase, punctuated letters. I found all sorts of men of different ranks, different class and ethnic background, writing home in that mode and enumerating at great length the variety of things that they found in Germans' houses. But not all enjoyed acting the part of conqueror, however. Some found it decidedly uncomfortable. To be the personal agent of others' misfortune after the war somehow felt worse than causing harm to enemy personnel on the battlefield. That was a sentiment that Leo Bogart, whose letter I showed you at the start, wrote home to his parents. But wherever they stood, GIs contemplated jarring contradictions in Germany. In a country where genocidal atrocities had just been exposed to the appalled gaze of incoming soldiers, reporters, and photographers, gardens overflowed with flowers. This was the spring, of course, so everything was in heightened bloom, and a lot of soldiers wrote home about the woozy perfume that they encountered in the countryside. Meanwhile, in German homes, crucifixes and beatific portraits of Jesus seemed to beam from every wall, though some Americans suspected that the Bible might have hastily supplanted Mein Kampf on German bookshelves as Allied forces approached. But while US troops might feel righteous satisfaction in shattering these smug sanctuaries of hypocrisy, intimate displacements could also occasion shudders of repugnance. Albert Hutler, a Jewish social worker from Chicago, who of course noted the irony that he was dealing with survivors of the Holocaust, and his name was A. Hutler, wrote sardonically to his wife from Mannheim in April 1945, "I sleep between pink sheets in the front room of a nice apartment that belonged to a Nazi." If moral gratification was in short supply amid wholesale obliteration, with the stench of death still haunting the atmosphere, the same was much less true of occupation's material rewards. The requisition of German homes naturally enough presented many opportunities for looting, although this was officially forbidden. Indeed, Germany as a whole presented, in Rick Atkinson's words, a world to be looted, noting that GIs quickly developed a punning sobriquet to crown their preeminent status in the realm of illicit acquisition. Looting spanned the gamut from petty pilfering of Nazi memorabilia to grand larceny. So one phenomenon that I found was men, again, of every rank and ethnicity, including many Jewish GIs, were struck that they were receiving impassioned pleas from the folk back home to send them swastikas, send them Nazi party banners, flags, other party insignia and emblems, which they often did. So if you can't read that at the back, this is a sardonic sign presided over by a Jewish GI saying, "These are rocks that Hitler, Goering, and Bormann walked over, help yourself." And here is another GI relaxing in the bath. The newspaper headline is about the Soviets approaching Berlin, and of course the swastika flag prominently draped over the bathtub. So we have every kind of acquisitiveness, from the acquisition of these party insignia to sort of stake for posterity, perhaps a personal role in Hitler's downfall, to illicit acquisition on the grandest of scales. Acquisitiveness was just as pronounced elsewhere, where populations had far less of value to be plundered than in still affluent Germany. In Okinawa, for instance, where 1/3 of the population was killed in the furious battle to control the island that raged from April to June of 1945, American troops quickly stripped local homes and tombs of portable assets. Souvenir hunting, in the euphemistic phrase of the day, became a pastime engaged in by men of every rank, including the naval lieutenant general in charge of military government on Okinawa. One Japanese-speaking officer, and I can't stress enough how incredibly few were the American Japanese-speaking officers, who took it upon himself to establish a museum which he hoped would preserve artifacts attesting the longevity and intricacy of Okinawan culture that was then in the process of wholesale destruction, feared that looters would make light work of his curatorial efforts if the museum were left unguarded for so much as an afternoon. Similarly, in the Japanese home islands, American troops who arrived a few weeks after the Vanguard cohort in September of 1945 sent home plaintive laments that all the good stuff, silk kimonos, fine ceramics, ceremonial swords, had been snapped up already. Given this stupendous scale of occupation soldiers' acquisitiveness, one might wonder how, or whether, GIs managed to sustain the sense of victimhood I earlier ascribed to them. After all, the material rewards of occupation soldiering were as conspicuous as they were hard to curtail. Official attempts to prohibit the mailing home of loot and other measures to curb black marketeering in the early months and years of military government repeatedly failed to staunch illicit appropriation and clandestine trade, and this was true absolutely everywhere that Americans occupied. Many lower-ranking men and women's situation ethics justified accumulation by dispossession as a legitimate form of compensation. This was owed to them both by defeated enemies and by their own military, which had stolen an immeasurably precious commodity, namely time, and offered insufficient compensation for lives that had been ruptured first by wartime call-up and were still stuck on hold by occupation duty. And this sense of entitlement grew plumper as enlisted men observed audacious swindles perpetrated by some senior officers, crimes beside which the liberation of occasional watches, cameras, or samurai swords paled into insignificance. The most spectacular case came to light in June 1946, when the theft of the Hessian crown jewels from a castle in Kronberg, a portion of which was traced back to a locker in Chicago's Illinois Central Station, was pinned on Black Captain Kathleen Nash and her boyfriend, Army Colonel Jack Durant. And they were both court-martialed, and their defense was essentially, well, everyone was doing this. So if everyone was stealing stuff, then surely this isn't really a crime. And although it was true that almost everyone was taking something or other, no one else had actually stolen millions of dollars worth of crown jewels and other precious items. So, if aggrieved subalterns routinely downplayed the extent to which tangible rewards accompanied occupation soldiering, was the same also true of its erotic compensations. And this is the title of the fourth chapter of my book. It's the one destined to become the most dog-eared, one suspects, in college libraries. This is a phrase that I borrowed from an instant history of the occupation of Germany that appeared in 1946. So the central dividend of occupation soldiering was abundantly apparent to anyone observing the German scene in mid-1945. They didn't need to wait for instant histories to appear a year later. Anyone who was in Germany, anyone reading the stateside press in 1945 from Europe or Japan a few months later knew that these countries were quite visibly and unmistakably awash with courting and copulating couples. Now, in Germany, this was all the more embarrassing to Schaef's highest echelons because under the terms of Eisenhower's ban on fraternization, which included in September of 1945, American soldiers oughtn't to have been so much as shaking hands with Germans. That being so, they certainly shouldn't have been fraternizing in the least brotherly sense of that word with German women. Now, the High Command took strenuous efforts to try to stamp out this behavior, including circulating handbills and posters like this one, which used images of victims of Nazi genocide to try to impress on soldiers that Germans were guilty. All Germans. This was the era when the sort of doctrine of collective guilt was still the guiding ethos of the occupation. So handbills like this one were circulated amongst GIs, but it really did nothing to stem the tide of fraternization. Entitlement to German women's bodies was one victory decisively scored by enlisted men. Rampant disregard for Schaef's non-fraternization order led quickly to its erosion and thence its complete abandonment in July of 1945. But even before Eisenhower acknowledged defeat, enlisted men had found ingenious ways to outmaneuver the band's strictures, claiming, for example, that the women they slept with weren't Germans, but rather displaced persons. So this is a photograph that appeared in Life magazine in July of 1945, and I'm sure that none of you can read the tiny small print, but the caption says something like, if captured in the act of fraternizing, the GI would claim that this was actually a displaced person. So an attempt to prevent this dodge, it was so ubiquitous that the senior commanders tried to get around this dodge by having displaced persons wear armbands, colored cloth armbands, literally displaying their nationality on their sleeves. But not surprisingly, GIs being incredibly ingenious, this simply led to a brisk black market trade in these armbands. In Japan, US authorities were the beneficiaries of a network of official brothels that the Japanese government had graciously seen fit to provide the occupiers, intended to protect the better class of Japanese women from American rapacity. So American servicemen often took some delight in recording, this is a photograph taken by one army medic, capturing the sort of pidgin English in which Japanese brothel owners tried to entice Americans into their establishments, and this was something certainly that American men wrote home about. So within a few weeks, General Eichelberger, the commander of the 8th Army, the primary occupation force in Japan, decided that the 8th Army couldn't really be seen to be presiding over such an arrangement, despite its benefits in terms of superior means of surveilling and controlling soldiers' exposure to sexually transmitted disease. So to maintain a respectable image for the occupational authorities, prostitution became a private enterprise in Japan, and various measures were taken to outlaw overt manifestations of sexual interaction between American men and local women. As in Germany, these typically failed. But in both Asia and Europe, sexual privilege remained an arena replete with grievance. The High Command's attempts to regulate intercourse between American men and occupied women seemed to violate a basic compact of wartime and post-war service, namely that heterosexual intercourse was an implicit, sometimes explicit, reward for soldiering. And from the perspective of enlisted men, curbs on their access to women also smacked of rank hypocrisy, as officers monopolized exclusive rights to the fanciest brothels, the best-looking local women, and all the American wax and Red Cross workers in sight. So this is one of Bill Morton's Willie Joe cartoons. This was a strip that appeared in Stars and Stripes. Morton made himself loathed by many senior officers, perhaps none more so than Patton, for encouraging this sense of grievance on the part of enlisted men against officers and their various privileges. So historians have tended to focus on the ways in which American soldiers' sexual relationships with German women animated German men's ire as rival claims to women's bodies collided. Now, such clashes did indeed occur, sometimes with lethal consequences, particularly if the perceived usurper were African American. But a less remarked phenomenon was envy that cut in the opposite direction as American GIs watched Wehrmacht soldiers going home to resume their civilian lives and loves. So the army simply couldn't manage to keep every German in uniform a POW. So we find that the Germans are indeed going home in the summer, and barely has the war ended before Germans are returning home. And on June 6, 1945, Leo Bogart wrote home to his parents in Brooklyn on the subject with some feeling. To the GI who is faithful to a woman back in the States, or who just wants to keep his nose clean and sticks to the non-fraternization rule, there is something extremely irritating in the sight of a Nazi soldier in his uniform walking slowly down the street of an evening in the embrace of a good-looking Fräulein. Doubtless, some other GIs resented such scenes precisely because they did not stick to the non-fraternization rule and regarded good-looking Fräuleins as the occupier's sexual terrain, presumptuously encroached on by Wehrmacht returnees, men whom they had supposedly defeated. Either way, it was a bitter irony that the vanquished should be able to enjoy the comforts of home, the longed-for rapture of reunion so far in advance of the victors. Dissatisfaction with the slow pace of demobilization underpinned American troops' mounting sense of injustice. Not surprisingly, many took victory to be synonymous with going home. So long as they remained confined in chafing uniforms, stuck overseas and subject to the onerous probations of military life, they remained in effect at war. Now, although military psychologists had anticipated that war's end would herald a precipitous slump in morale, they nevertheless underestimated the speed and totality of this tailspin. The point system that determined eligibility for release was widely perceived by enlisted men as unfair and rigged in favor of officers and the so-called chairborne division. It didn't help matters any that the Secretary of War, Robert Patterson, himself seemed unaware of how scores were tabulated. Over the course of the summer, fall, and early winter of 1945, enlisted men's fury mounted, and it would culminate in January of 1946 with a rash of demonstrations, variously dubbed GI riots or near-mutinies, as uniformed personnel paraded their demands for instant demobilization down the streets of Frankfurt, Paris, London, Manila, and Tokyo. Criticism of the sluggish pace of demobilization was accentuated by a critique of the military caste system. In more radicalized quarters, GIs also denounced the use of occupation troops to help restore European colonial rule over Asian countries from which Japanese troops had ejected it, noting also that some demobilized Japanese troops were now being drafted into the Chinese Civil War alongside Americans on the nationalist side. So the protest movement encompassed a host of discontent. But many anti-GIs shared the conviction that combat veterans had earned an immediate discharge, and that new recruits ought to be drafted to serve as occupation forces, if anyone had to serve in this role. When the war ended, and for months thereafter, the United States government failed to announce how long the occupations of defeated former enemy states would last. This wasn't surprising. They didn't know. But since some highly placed individuals talked in terms of decades or even generations, enlisted men could be forgiven, I think, for finding the vagueness of that timeline frustrating. And if it was uncertain how long occupation would last, it also appeared unclear to many foot soldiers what exactly they remained in Germany and Japan for. In sweeping terms, US military government was committed to the deindustrialization, denazification, and demilitarization of Germany, and equivalent sort of root and branch overhauls of Japan. These were grand objectives, but how did elite visions of extreme makeover translate into day-to-day activity for occupation troops? For many, lofty goals simply didn't generate lengthy to-do lists. So a yawning chasm separated the purposefulness implied by the term occupation and the tedium of day-to-day existence in post-war Germany. For while enemy territory was occupied, Americans' time was not, or so vast numbers of enlisted men and officers complained in their letters home in the declining months of 1945. Idleness, or the perception of underemployment, fueled the collapse in morale. And this disintegration of esprit did, in fact, accelerate the pace of demobilization in 1946, with results that many senior officers regarded as catastrophic. So occupation personnel who trained to occupy particular places, and this was particularly true in the Pacific, men who'd even spent a short period of time studying the Japanese language, studying Japanese cities, often ended up never even reaching their intended destinations. If they had enough points, they were eligible to go home. And the whole architecture of military government rapidly crumbled. Now, of course, while complaining of rank tedium, many uniformed Americans found and were promptly given plenty to distract them. Shopping and sex, in that order, were occupation soldiers' biggest leisure pursuits. Both activities were directly or indirectly boosted by the military establishment. Eager to amuse and appease legions of bored and restless young men, they constructed impressive PXs. They restored swimming pools and playing fields, they organized team games and athletic meets, and they inaugurated a vast system of organized tourism across Europe and also in Japan. Tens of hotels, rest centers were established across the Japanese home islands. Now, paradoxically, but predictably enough, these efforts to address demobilization contributed substantially to demoralizing the army in a different sense, making GI consumers both more mobile and better provisioned black market players wherever they went with their cheap goods and their plentiful grub. Now, this seems to me to sort of capture many of the very mixed messages that occupation soldiers were receiving. So when the Nuremberg trials begin, Nuremberg, which was already a sort of site on the GI tourist circuit itinerary, also was a site for the sort of moral education, that attending a day pass to attend the Nuremberg trials was intended to also have a sort of edifying impact to remind soldiers that they were there to perform important work of denazification. But at the very same time, this was a photograph that Robert Jackson bequeathed, which is now at the Harry Truman Library, shows that the Nuremberg trial site itself had a PX where you would go and stock up on cheap cigarettes and other consumer goods. So what kind of message was one taking away from all of this? Now, at the same time, army commanders sought to improve their orientation and indoctrination programs, believing that failure to properly inform enlisted men about the larger political purposes of occupation had enabled discontent to take root. Henceforth, troops would be given regular lectures on the necessity of Germany and Japan's democratizing overhaul and the importance of enlisted men's role in winning the peace. Now, I don't think it's really quite the case that a failure of indoctrination was at the root of all of this. I'm going to sort of skip hastily to the next part of my talk. Many GIs were quite eloquent in rebutting the opinions of influential figures like Anne McCormick, whose picture I just lost over to save a few minutes since I'm running rather short on time. And I want to sort of come to some of my more important remarks. I think that the sort of nub of the problem for many enlisted men was that really they were being asked in many ways to be symbolic bodies. Their role in Germany and Japan was to be an exemplary presence, to be a deterrent presence, to be watchful and also to be watched. And whatever the value of being a symbolic body was, it of course didn't impress itself on many enlisted men as something that merited their time, particularly if they'd already been deployed for long years as combat forces. They increasingly sort of said, well, in some cases, yes, we think occupation is a valid mission, but someone else should be drafted to do it. So there were all sorts of unhappinesses in the mix, and soldiers of every political persuasion became increasingly unhappy, and left progressive GIs in particular increasingly writing home and lamenting the fact that they think that denazification isn't going far enough, and similarly in Japan, they're very aware of the chasm between the declaratory politics of de-imperializing Japan and the fact that Hirohito remains in place as emperor. Now, where left progressive Americans feared that the occupations were going soft, conservatives thought just the opposite, and that's what I want to devote my attention to in the last few minutes of my talk. What I found perhaps most surprising about the emotional landscape of American-occupied Germany is neither that many of the victors understood themselves as victims of either malign fortune or structural subordination, nor that many of the vanquished, many Germans, already claimed to that identity. After all, Germans had been widely expected to lapse into lachrymose self-pity, regretting less that they had started a war than their failure to win it. That was a widespread view of American psychologists, American area experts during the war. What I found most striking from as early as the winter of 1945-46 onwards is the number of prominent American officers who endorsed Germans' sense of victimhood, feeling a kindred sense of grievance, sometimes solidified by shared anti-Semitism. It bears emphasizing that in post-war Germany, victors and vanquished didn't confront one another in isolation. Not only were other occupying powers often in the mix, so too were myriad displaced persons. Now, this displaced person population was of sort of multiple ethnicities. In the first instance, there were millions of former forced laborers who the Germans had brought into Germany from the Soviet Union, the Baltic states, Southern Europe, from all over the place. And many of these, millions of these newly liberated forced laborers were being put onto boxcars and taken out of Germany just as quickly as rolling stock and boxcars could be located in the spring and summer of 45. While Soviet DPs were being shunted east, they were replaced by swirling numbers of ethnic Germans who were being ejected from East Central Europe and whose presence is starting to change the very category of German at this time. And then there were those stateless individuals whom, as Tina Grossman poignantly puts it, the Allies had least expected to find in post-war Germany. Jewish survivors of Nazi genocide, numbering some 250,000 in the US zone of Germany by early 1946. Now, though this surviving remnant of European Jewry was woefully small, Jewish DPs loomed large in the politics of occupation. Arguably, nothing did more to increase some American soldiers' dissatisfaction with what they perceived as a harsh peace than a feeling that Germans were being unfairly punished while, or indeed because, Jewish DPs were hampered. Such sentiments grew in the wake of the scathing Harrison report released on August 31st, 1945. This was Truman's special representative sent to investigate conditions in displaced persons camps. And Harrison urged separate and superior treatment for Jewish DPs, who were henceforth to be elevated, at least in theory, to the same standard of living as Germans. Now, this goal would be met through stepped-up requisitions of homes and apartments and larger calorie allocations to Jewish DPs. And then this photograph from the Holocaust Museum shows German women who were being evicted from their homes in Landsberg, which had been the home to a Nazi camp, then after the war is home both to a Jewish DP camp side by side with a camp where SS war criminals are being held and are being executed in the same site. So many of these sites, Landsberg was also where Hitler drafted some of Mein Kampf, so the same sites are being recycled many times over, in some cases hold these two disparate populations in different sort of carceral circumstances. Now, in the aftermath of the Harrison report, no one voiced more strident complaints about the alleged unfairness of Harrison's prescriptions than George Patton. If for Jews, why not for Catholics, Mohammedans, etc.? He testily asked his diary. He would discharge Ike's orders to appropriate German homes for DPs, he said, but grudgingly, taking aim at what he scathingly dubbed sort of improved ghettos. And in fact, he violated both the spirit and the letter of Ike's orders, because supposedly Germans, like these women who were being evicted from their homes, were only allowed to take a modest amount of clothing and bedding and leave the rest of their household possessions for Jewish DPs. And Patton made it very clear that he was going to not only look the other way, but provide military transportation for Germans to remove as much of their sort of portable wealth as they possibly could. Now, similar views percolated through the ranks with like-minded men, I imagine, emboldened to express prejudicial sentiments by the general's noxious outspokenness. Germans, they maintained, were being punished because of the preponderant influence, as these people perceived it, of American Jews in military government, who enabled the conniving machinations of Jewish DPs. The latter, anti-Semitic Americans and Germans agreed, were primarily responsible for post-war Germany's thriving black market. This accusation, repeating centuries-old slurs, was manifestly absurd. Everyone participated in Germany's black market, and those with more to trade clearly enjoyed greater access and larger profits. But however misplaced, the accusation enjoyed widespread currency. As winter approached in 1945, disgruntled American officers and men grew bolder in expressing dismay that Germans were to be starved and frozen to death as a result of what they alleged were deliberate US policies of extermination. From Berlin, Army Colonel Jack Whitehall railed to his wife, "Belsen and Buchenwald were nothing when you consider the plight of all of Germany." These words he wrote in November 1945. Attentive American civilians were made aware of this astonishingly swift recrudescence of anti-Semitism among their armed forces. Some journalists attempted to pin the blame for prejudice on the German women with whom GIs were sleeping. In such constructions, GIs were once again victims, guileless dupes of manipulative Fräuleins who not only traded sexual favors for candy bars, but used their intimate access to American boys' hearts to poison their minds. This strikes me as one of the more dubiously self-serving constructions of US victimhood. No doubt, certain Germans did attempt to cultivate American anti-Semitism, just as they sought to kindle anti-Soviet sentiment, and some were probably rather artful manipulators. But a more clear-sighted analysis would remind us that not infrequently, Americans needed little, if any, encouragement to side with Germans, whose claims to kinship and sympathy many found more persuasive than the plight of Jewish DPs. So it's one of the more lamentable ironies of US-occupied Germany that victors and vanquished should so swiftly have validated one another's sense of grievance, turning the first and worst victims of the Third Reich, in Harrison's words, into scapegoats and pariahs. And a roughly analogous process also occurred in Japan, where American occupation forces quickly converged in shared disapprobation for the country's 2 million strong Korean minority, where pernicious racialization had been fostered by 4 decades of colonial rule. So Korea, I think, is one of the most interesting occupations because Korea, by rights, one would imagine, ought to have been liberated as a Japanese colony. Instead, Korea perhaps receives the most punitive of all the occupations. Meanwhile, Koreans in Japan find themselves subject to forcible attempts to relocate them back to Korea, whether they had ever lived in Korea or not, as the United States presided over this vast attempt to unmix populations in Asia. And I think this is perhaps one of the least well-known stories of post-war and the great sort of ethnic untanglings, ethnic reshufflings that occur in the aftermath of war, is the strenuous efforts that the United States made to try to not just bring Japanese home from places that Japan had colonized and the millions of demobilized Japanese soldiers, but also to replace minorities in countries where the United States felt they belonged. So Japanese are being shipped out of Korea, and at the same time, Koreans are being sort of forcibly encouraged to leave the Japanese home islands, where they remain or where they sort of try to get back. Like Jewish DPs in Germany, Koreans were routinely blamed for Japan's pervasive black market, simultaneously deemed dangerous sources of contagion, ideological and epidemiological alike. So I reach my conclusion. By early 1946, prominent opinion formers, perhaps none more prominent than John Dos Passos, had begun to propose that victory was being lost. Americans had seemingly neglected to heed Eisenhower's injunction, written into the very first proclamation that was pasted up by occupation troops in Germany, that they comport themselves as conquerors, not oppressors. But treading the fine line between conquest and oppression was a balancing act not easily performed. Contemporary verdicts differed over where responsibility lay for Americans' poor showing overseas. Some critics blamed the youth and ignorance of boys in uniform, who got younger as combat troops were demobilized and new recruits replaced them, and this happened very rapidly in the early months of 1946. Others took aim at the corrupting environment endemic to occupied territory, where post-war relations were so lopsided in power terms that sleazy transactions were bound to structure everyday life. Although the concept of moral hazard is of more recent vintage, contemporary anatomists of occupational malaise appreciated its symptoms very well. One veteran, Walter J. Slatoff, writing in the New Republic in May 1946, described how a buddy who had emerged from combat without a scratch became, as he put it, a casualty in Berlin nearly a year after war's end. The victim of a city in which vice, corruption, and callousness have reached a point that defies description. Imagine your own 18 or 19-year-old son removed entirely from your supervision, ill-treated sorrow, given an almost unlimited supply of money, granted a power over women equal to that of Van Johnson or Clark Gable, fed a steady diet of lines and stories calculated to inspire suspicion, hate, and cynicism, and placed among a people who had lost all moral standards. Was it any wonder that the ruined and ruinous former German capital was claiming so many GI casualties? The hazards and rewards of occupation soldiering were, it seemed, inextricably entangled. In the immediate aftermath of war, Americans in and out of uniform knew this very well. Occupation soldiers wrote home and told loved ones so. This is what I spent years reading. And so did scores of journalists and a smaller number of novelists who offered up gritty portraits of occupation, with far more emphasis on squalor than love. Some of you may remember Jane Salinger's story of Esme with Love and Squalor, in which the eponymous heroine asks a GI who she befriends in England whether he is at all acquainted with squalor, and he replies, and we've just seen the accounts, yes, he is becoming more acquainted with it all the time. And she asks that when he goes back to Germany, he should write to her, including ample quantities of love and squalor. So my book has a lot of squalor and a much smaller quotient of love, which I think Esme would have been pleased by. But these textured appreciations of occupation, which I unearthed, gave way, I think, in the 1950s, coming back to the book I imagined while I was in residence at the center that I would write, I think gave way at some point in the mid-50s to some fantastical projections of occupation, which were peddled by Hollywood movies, perhaps none more strikingly than MGM's Tea House of the August Moon, based on a best-selling novel and stage play, which offered up this whimsical notion of occupation in which, as one of the American characters says, it becomes impossible even to tell who is the occupier and who is the occupied. A message which is given horrible fleshly incarnation in Marlon Brando appearing in yellow face makeup as an Okinawan. Hollywood's projections, it seems to me, surely helped engender the reassuring, calamitous delusion that occupiers would be greeted with sweets and flowers as they entered Baghdad in 2003. 60 years earlier, no one harbored such fanciful notions. Americans expected occupation to be difficult and dangerous, is a phrase I kept encountering, even if they underestimated both the scale and nature of the challenges posed by reordering societies after long years of ruinous war. So it's those more complicated understandings of what it meant to be part of an occupying army, what the work of occupation was, that my book has aimed to recapture. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for a fascinating presentation here. We'll open it up to your comments and questions. Let me just say much of it worked on American policy in post-war Germany rings very much true, and reading, I remember being struck by how reading in the John McCloy, how positive McCloy wrote about Germans in the early 1900s, at the end of the war. I wonder if you have thought about putting this in a sort of comparative perspective, because especially, having worked at the home of the Cold War History Project, we work as much on the communist, the Soviet side of things. And of course, very much focused on sexual relations under occupation, and that's a huge issue, of course, in the occupation, the Soviet occupation zone. The pervasive daily occurrence of sexual violence in the Soviet zone that had a profound impact on how Germans related to Russians, not just in the years of occupation, but for a generation. Does that help? Does that put things in perspective? How good the American occupation is?
Comparatively speaking, there was a lot of back and forth with my editor at Harvard Press about the title of the book and whether or not it would be properly understood that this was an ironic title. And in fact, last fall I was lucky enough to have a fellowship at the Shelby Cullom Davis Center at Princeton, and there I a number of times greeted the response, well, if we'd known you were British, we wouldn't have been so worried about the title of your project, but we thought you were going to be offering up some triumphalist history about the occupations. But, you're British, so of course, irony being the sea in which my people swim. So yes, I mean, the title is intended to have an ironic frisson. Of course, the subtitle, The American Soldiers and the Hazard of Peace, underscores that. But in comparison with other occupying forces, and of course with the Soviets in particular, the Americans look considerably better. I mean, there's some sort of controversy just in the last year or so. The Journal of Interdisciplinary History published an essay last year by 2 Australian scholars who have done statistical work in the National Archives, in which they sort of corroborate a German historian's claims that the rates of rape perpetrated by American soldiers were much higher than had hitherto been thought. And they may indeed have been much higher than were hitherto thought, but nevertheless they are nowhere near as high as the level of rapes conducted by Soviet soldiers. One of the things I was struck by there was that rather infrequently did American soldiers write about that, even the men whose letters and diaries I was reading from Berlin. And even though very rapidly they start to evidence signs of a sort of anti-Soviet feeling, if they didn't have that to begin with, it often didn't take too many weeks for them to reach a rather negative appreciation of their Soviet allies. They didn't really say very much about that question in their letters and diaries, which is peculiar perhaps in some ways. You began your question asking about the need or the desirability of comparative work, and I think that's something that we are starting to see a little bit more of. I mean, for me, it seemed enough to engage in a comparative project of occupation soldiers in the various different countries that Americans occupied, because one of the things that's really striking about the literature is how infrequently studies of occupation actually deal with more than one country. So it's a very balkanized literature. There are lots of studies about the occupation of Germany, lots of other studies about Japan, a tiny number about Korea, a smallish number about Italy. But my book, I think, is one of rather few to actually try to encompass the whole scope of occupation. So for now, that seemed to be as much comparative work as I could tackle, but I absolutely agree that we need more of it.
Let me follow up with a question that centers around the proposition, was the occupation doomed from the outset? You make a point in the book that Americans are not new to occupation, even though they might pretend or think that they are. They established a school in Charlottesville to train, so at least they had some sense what was to come, and unlike perhaps subsequent occupations, some planning went into what was ahead on the agenda. But at the end of the day, the sense that one gets is that it couldn't have been much different given the naivete of the Americans, given the prejudices of the various officers that you write so powerfully about, given the youthfulness of the conscripts, and given the politics of demobilization, the fact that parents are mobilizing on the home front to bring their children home or husbands home as quickly as possible. So given the planning, or the extent to which it took place, I still get the sense in the book that you don't quite imagine any other outcome than the one that happened. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes, you are reading that correctly. Let me perhaps just pick up on some of the many things that you offered up in your question. And of course, I only had 45 minutes to cover a 400-page book. So I left out, other than one slide very early on, I left out the entirety of the first chapter of the book, which deals with planning. And intriguingly enough, Americans were planning for post-war before the United States had even formally entered the war. So one certainly could not say that there was an absence of planning. One couldn't say that the planning was belated. But one thing that I found almost every occupation soldier saying, and this was particularly true of the men who had attended Charlottesville or one of the other CAT schools, so-called, was that almost none of them thought that their training had been adequate. And this was a motif I found over and over again. It was something that soldiers wrote home to their loved ones, and it was suddenly also corroborated by an extensive survey that the Human Research Office at Johns Hopkins conducted on behalf of the military in, I think, 1955 or 6, a big sort of 300 or so page study which devotes a substantial chapter to training, and almost everyone that was surveyed, of hundreds of men of the officer rank, said that they didn't believe their training had been adequate. Why was that? I think, of course, well, various reasons. That they were being trained at the outset for 4 months, that the training program shrank as it became clear that Charlottesville, even with a dozen more universities added to this program, was never going to produce sufficient numbers of occupation personnel. And of course, the problem of occupying Japan is compounded by the fact that there were almost no Americans, or almost no white Americans, who speak Japanese. So a hasty attempt to microscopically scrutinize Nisei in internment camps and Japanese Americans in Hawaii and bring them into sort of special training programs for Japanese interpreters and translators. Language skills are part of it. You cannot learn Japanese in 4 months. I spent a year trying to learn Chinese, and I know by the end of my year, I certainly would have made a miserable occupation soldier if I'd been going to occupy China at the end of that year. So there are, of course, built-in academic limitations, the political limitations, the politics of race as they factor into this. But I think the lament that many occupation soldiers made was, of course, that no matter how good their training had been, nothing could really have prepared them for the extent of devastation that they encountered. So contingency is of the essence. In some cases at Charlottesville, they've been looking at very detailed municipal plans. They knew what the sewage system of Mannheim looked like. They knew where the electricity grid was located. They knew all sorts of stuff. How much of that was actually left after the RAF and American bombers had done their work? In many cities, very, very little. And then, of course, there's the sort of human intangibles. They weren't expecting to find as many millions of refugees. And of course, although UNRWA is being planned from an early stage in the war, UNRWA wasn't ready to do this. I mean, there was a huge debate in FDR's cabinet that was never really settled, even though the military ostensibly win the argument. They get to have a school of military government at Charlottesville. It will be military government, not some civilian department that's providing over these ventures. Nevertheless, there's still some huge ongoing debates about this, and many people saying, well, it should really be civilians who do this, but no civilian agency had the capacity to step into places that combat had just sort of rumbled through and over, and deliver food, provide security. And of course, in Germany, they expected that there was going to be armed resistance. So UNRWA wasn't either ready or able to do this. And occupation soldiers, not surprisingly, find that they're confronting extremists that nothing has prepared them to palliate, to tackle. And they differ over the ultimate question. Would it have been possible to have been better trained? Some of them think that yes, it would, and others of them think, no, actually the key attribute of a good occupation officer is flexibility, is empathy, and ability to improvise. And others think that's exactly the problem, that too many people were running around thinking that they could just do stuff on the fly, and that you didn't really have to know the language, you didn't really have to understand the people. So it remained a very fraught phenomenon. And to answer your question, which I already did by saying yes, I will answer it again by saying I'm not sure how you do very much better than the United States did in circumstances of such profound objection, in circumstances which lend themselves at best to very murky transactional sorts of encounters.
Thank you. Yep. If you could please wait for the microphone and identify yourself.
Stephen Shore,
Yeah.
a wonderful talk. One subject you've not covered in your talk is GIs from Germany and Japan who returned home with foreign wives. You know, the officers could ignore assignations, but when you have to allow GIs to bring home foreign brides has requisite paperwork, and officialdom has to opine. So I'm wondering if you could tell that story.
Well, I can briefly tell that story. I would also recommend, if you're interested in this story, a wonderful book written by a colleague and friend of mine, Susan Zeiger, called Entangling Alliances, about war brides throughout the 20th century. And she does a splendid job of telling this story at much greater length than I do in the book. And with stunning speed, Americans weren't just sleeping with women wherever they went, they were also seeking to marry them. And this was true across Europe, and it was also true in Asia. Now, in Asia, they of course encounter far more obstacles, because there's the sort of problem that arises there is of race and marriage, and whether it's possible for Americans to bring home brides, bearing in mind that many states in 1945, 46, I mean into the 1960s, have anti-miscegenation statutes on the books. How is this going to pan out at home? So for far more years in occupied Japan, it is impossible, technically speaking, for an American to marry a Japanese bride. But in both Germany and Japan, even when it is outlawed by officialdom, it's impossible to prevent men from marrying in local ceremonies. So Americans are going off and finding Shinto priests who will perform, local ceremonies, which may not have any standing with the Eighth Army, but are good enough for them. And it's not until 1952 that finally, which is the last year of the occupation in Japan, that Americans are officially allowed to marry Japanese women. That happens much, much sooner in Germany because, of course, there's not the same sort of racial prohibition on marriage that's animating a good deal of concern. So from 1946 onwards, GIs can marry German women legitimately, but illegitimately they have been doing that almost from before the war is even over.
Right up here. Fred Augustine, Library of Congress. You mentioned in your talk very teasingly and more amply in your book, which I have, and I'm looking forward to reading it at greater length, Italy. And the occupation, Allied occupation of Italy began earlier and ended earlier. Presumably, Italy also had to be de-imperialized because it certainly had colonies, Libya, Eritrea, Ethiopia. In the interest of comparison, how did the Italian experiment contrast with Germany and Japan?
Well, Italy is really sui generis because, of course, the first
parts of Italy that are occupied, beginning with Sicily in the middle of 1943, and then fairly soon thereafter, southern Italy, Naples, and so on, become co-belligerents. So this is a very odd status to be, that Italy is occupied in part by the Allies and occupied in the northern part of the Italian peninsula by the Germans. Italy is both an ally, but also under US occupation. So as some Italians see it, they're a sort of mistrusted ally. And I think the occupation of Italy, which I deal with less extensively than Germany and Japan, is a particularly intriguing one. I treat Italy mostly in the chapter that deals with training and occupation, because of course at Charlottesville and elsewhere, Americans were looking very beady-eyed at Sicily and southern Italy to try to see how well things were going. And of course it was already then acknowledged that the occupations of North Africa had been disastrous. They'd been certainly politically disastrous, at least in the eyes of sort of liberals who hoped that a sort of de-fascisizing project, if that's the right word, was really going to govern the politics of occupation. And of course, quickly deals are made with pro-Vichy French in North Africa. And I think partly for that reason, of course, there's a lot of alertness to signs that deals are being made with the wrong kind of Italians. And yes, there is indeed an attempt to sort of boot fascists out in Sicily and elsewhere. And there's a lot of anxious commentary, both on the ground and in the United States itself, about the role that Italian Americans play in the occupation, because there were a significant number of Italian Americans were occupation troops. And this was a very marked phenomenon in Sicily. And actually, when I gave my talk at the Wilson Center 6 years ago, the portion of it that I showcased on that occasion dealt with what I regarded then as now as the sort of template of the cultural good occupation, which was John Hersey's A Bel Fredano. And that was the piece of the project I wrote first. So this was a novel which was hugely, hugely popular that appeared in 1944, based on the week or so that Hersey spent in Sicily. And he valorizes an Italian-American major, loosely based on a real Italian-American, who becomes a sort of beloved avatar of the good occupation. And Hersey's sort of moralizing parable was really to the effect that occupation could indeed be good, needed to be good to redeem all the sort of misery and squalor and awfulness of the war. And he bills Italian Americans really as the preeminent, best qualified occupation troops with the language skills and the cultural sensitivity to appreciate that what the Italians really need isn't necessarily food or anything material, but it's something spiritual. Hence the Bel Fredano is what the townspeople of this made-up place, based on a real place, Licata, most wanted. Now, in real life, I went and looked at Hersey's papers, which are at Yale, and there's the notebook of the real-life model for his beloved hero, Major Victor Joppolo. Victor, get it, in case you haven't figured out that he is indeed the exemplary Victor. So in the notebook of Frank Toscani, who Victor Joppolo is loosely modeled on, there is, unsurprisingly enough, no mention of a church bell. There are a lot of mentions of desperately hungry people and somewhat fewer mentions of desperately badly behaved American troops. So there are indeed references to sexual violence, to rape, things which Hersey really very much sidelines in the novel. Now, interestingly enough, one of the sort of primary, most highly ranked Americans in Sicily and then in the occupation of southern Italy was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Paletti, who had briefly served, I think, for about 2 weeks as governor of the state of New York before he joined the Army of Occupation. And Paletti, in some quarters, was billed as being the model for Joppolo, although he wasn't. But it was really interesting to look at. I looked at Paletti's papers, which are at Columbia. I looked at Kenneth Royal's papers at the University of North Carolina, and Royal was sent to do a sort of biopsy of the occupation in Sicily, and he said he'd never seen so much infighting in any organization, because infighting wasn't just between the Brits and the Americans, and it was a British aristocrat who headed the operation in Sicily, Lord Rennell of Rod, and Poletti and Rod clearly loathed one another. But all sorts of people thought that Poletti was, both British and American, thought that Poletti was too uncouth, too much of an attention hog, basically too Italian or too American or too much of both, too anti-fascist in quarters who felt that the occupation was going precisely too far in the direction that you have hinted at. So again, I mean, it was impossible to, this is sort of Goldilocks syndrome of occupation, that it seemingly was impossible everywhere to get the politics of occupation just right.
Ross, why don't we're quickly running out of time, so why don't we take a few questions at a time, and then Susan, you can decide which ones you'll want to
talk over drinks and.
That's right. So, Ross?
Ross Johnson. Yeah, Sunanya. Maybe I'm a contrarian. I'm a little puzzled at the negative, the negative picture here. Yes, lots, and I don't have the book, so I'm just from this discussion. Yes, a lot of terrible things happen, but in the comparative perspective that Christians mentioned, I mean, we've got that. We don't have any counterpart in the American zones of occupation. I speak only of Germany and Austria. We don't have any counterpart to the monument to the unknown rapist in the Soviet zone in Vienna. And then, I mean, if we compare Germany, where, in 47 with Iraq in 2005, I mean, wasn't something done right? Wasn't this a good occupation, actually, for all the bad things that may have happened? And certainly many people were ill-trained, poorly trained, but surely some of them were more capable. And I mean, I know some examples, and no doubt we all do. One was Ernst Langendorf, a social democrat in the American Army. He was the press officer in the Bavarian occupation, issued press license number 1 to Süddeutsche Zeitung, and they respected him then and forever after. So is the picture actually so bleak?
Okay, hold on. We'll take a few questions at a time. Kent Hughes, and then
Kent Hughes at the Wilson Center. Thank you, Susan. This is really fascinating. 2 questions. What was the British and French experience like in areas where they occupied? And second, since more Americans are from Germans than any other single ethnicity, did that influence the rapport in Germany between American troops and the occupied?
thank you. Roger? And I was...
Roger Lewis. Okay. Susan, this is beyond your scope, but I wonder if you could just say a word about the way German historians have dealt with some of these issues, not the historiography, but just works that you found useful.
Okay, and we'll take these 2 brief, short questions there. Please be brief. And
yeah, Steve Lipson. I'm interested in the sources. You used letters and memoirs and diaries, and in terms of what you think, in terms of which ended up being more honest or full disclosure, or is it what we'd expect? And were there some things that were often mentioned in one of these sources but not others?
okay, thank you. Final question over there. Yeah.
Michael Neufeld, Air and Space Museum. I had a question just about African American soldiers. I realized there's not enough time, too many things to talk about, but it came to mind simply because I read this review on the last week of a new book about Emmett Till and his father, who was actually hanged for a rape and murder, perhaps under somewhat dubious evidence at the end of in the occupation. I can't remember now if it's Italy or Germany.
Thank you. 5 questions, 5 minutes left.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, to address Ross's contrarian question, I think that's a good question, because, of course, I am in danger, perhaps, of suggesting an excessively negative picture, and it wasn't all negative. And as you say, things turned out okay in the end. And of course, we know that Germany and Japan became the sort of cornerstone allies of the new post-war American order in Europe and Asia. And of course, many good things ensued, and many of the relationships that soldiers entered into with Germans and Japanese of different sexes, same sex, were positive. They weren't necessarily exploitative relationships. So I don't want to be seen to be saying that all of this was awful, this was an abomination, unlike the authors of the sort of newest article on figures of American rapes in Germany, that we should really be taking the American occupation forces to have been as bad as the Red Army. This is not my project. What I wanted to do, though, was to sort of unsettle, to my mind, the sort of unsatisfactory ways in which occupation has been preserved in popular culture and memory, which I think have gone far too far in the opposite direction of erasing every sort of piece of nuance, everything that was indeed messy, squalid about these occupations, and a lot of it was at a day-to-day level, even if it all turned out okay in the grander scheme of things in the end. I think it's politically helpful as well as a sort of historically necessary project to understand occupation as something which is incredibly difficult in day-to-day terms and which at best involves an awful lot of compromise, an awful lot of graft, and some pretty grubby and venal behavior. Not all of it, but that, I felt, is what had gone missing. And I think the sort of popular cultural representations from Hersey onwards, but perhaps particularly Tea House of the August Moon, which I sort of single out for a special treatment because it seems to me especially remarkable to imagine that a film which purports to be set in Okinawa, of all places, in 1946, should be able to obliterate every trace of the ruinous violence that was done to the island, quite apart from casting Marlon Brando as an Okinawan. And I think, the starting point for the project, I'm entirely candid about this, and if you do look at the book, in the very first 2 pages, I announced that how I first got the idea to write about this book was that I, like many other historians, was very troubled by the way in which historical analogies with Germany and Japan were being raised by the Bush administration in the 6 months leading up to Operation Iraqi Freedom. And of course, John Dower and many other prominent historians said, well, wait a minute, it's not going to be like this. I mean, if the best condition for a good occupation is the complete ruination of a country after long years of absolutely all-out mobilization and war, we had better not be thinking that we are going to have optimal conditions for a good occupation in Iraq. So, that was what set me thinking about, well, how did Americans not just understand occupation in cultural terms, but what was it like? So let me come along to some of the other questions in my remaining probably 2 minutes now. What was the picture like in the British and French zones? Well, the British and French zones, I leave primarily to, dare I say, British historians and French historians. I'm struck that a lot more comparative work is being done. I was at a conference in London where historians of the occupation of Germany, other than the Soviet zone, were all gathered together. So now I think for the first time we're really starting to see much more of that comparative history, and a book of that conference will in due course appear, which I will let you know about. I think it's really interesting that in Japan, although there were British and Commonwealth occupation forces, I very rarely found Americans talking about their encounters with other nationalities of occupation forces, and the sort of zones of jurisdiction were largely separate. So that kind of comparative picture wasn't one that emerged very often in my book. I think more so in Italy than anywhere else. I found much more carping about the Brits in Sicily and southern Italy than anywhere else. And a lot of carping about the Soviets from men who were stationed in Berlin. Yes, there was a lot of very interesting work being done by German historians, many of whom younger German historians were at this conference that the German Historical Institute organized in September, and I have been influenced by a lot of that, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of it, which is being done in exactly the same kind of day-to-day level. And this, to me, seems one of the most interesting areas of research that historians of the occupation of different nationalities are now undertaking, which is to try to do a sort of history from the bottom. I mean, a lot of the work of scholars has been on sort of the high politics of occupation, the politics of re-education, cultural reconstruction, but the day-to-day life of occupation, I think, only now is starting to receive its due attention. As for the sources I used, yes, absolutely. I mean, the vast majority of my sources were indeed what historians like to call ego documents, so the letters and diaries. I showed a couple of slides at the start, just to give some sense of the sort of typical stuff I was looking at, and I had to look pretty hard. So it was fun for me to travel to places that I hadn't necessarily been before. There's a good collection of World War II materials at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, which I spent a happy spring break digging through. There's an excellent Veterans Museum and Archive in Wisconsin-Madison, another town I hadn't visited. I went to many new places. And one of the sort of most exciting things about this book was that it took me to archives that I think have been very little looked at before. Because as I said at the beginning, I think so often combat-focused histories of the war do just come to this astonishingly abrupt conclusion. Peace broke out, it would seem. There's maybe, an epilogue of 6 pages. Rick Atkinson's, fantastically detailed 3-volume trilogy about the war devotes about 5 pages to what happened after VE Day. And of course, I think that mentality that combat is the preeminent branch of martial endeavor also shapes curatorial practices. So I think, there's a reason why I found far more material about the early phase of occupation, which is what a lot of my book deals with 1945 and 1946, and a smaller amount with 47, 48 as the occupations dig in and get domesticated. But I suspect, soldiers were, of course, still writing home. In some cases, home had come to them, and that's where I end the book, by talking about how this all gets dug in as wives and families are brought over and new military communities take shape. But I think probably less of those letters and diaries were preserved, because it probably didn't seem as though that generation of thoroughly post-war occupation soldiers were writing something that was as consequential. So I was sort of struck by how much my documentary record seemed to peter out as 1946 and 47 wore on. Finally, African-American soldiers, yes, critical part of my story. I found some very useful materials at the Schomburg collection, which is the sort of part of the New York Public Library devoted to African-American, Africana collections. And Norman Reddick, who had curated that collection, not yet then located in Harlem, the Schomburg Center, made it his business to try to assemble as many letters written home by African-American servicemen as he possibly could, and he conducted a whole array of oral history interviews at the New York Public Library. So if any of you are interested in those sources, there are some boxes of really fascinating material. And of course, African-American occupation soldiers found themselves in an interesting sort of structural position, a variety of sort of structural binds and contradictions as a result of institutional racism. Of course, the largest one is that here they are part of what purports to be a democratizing force, members of a segregated military. As members of a segregated military, they found themselves consigned to often the sort of lowliest work of occupation. They moved stuff about. They drove trucks. But one of the unintended ironies of that that sort of menial structural subordination was that they often had superior access to stuff. So they were rather well positioned as black market players, which many of Reddick's interviewees attested that they actually, did very well with women wherever they went, which some of his subjects were keen to tell him wasn't just the very celebrated African-American journalist, Roy Otley, was one of them, that it wasn't just because they had more C and K rations at their disposal, but they were actually kindlier. They sort of understood the privations of post-war better and had superior wooing techniques to win over women wherever they went. But of course, the sort of much more disturbing flip side of the coin is that they also found themselves far more frequently accused of rape and sexual violence and tried, court-martialed for those offenses at a far greater rate than their white counterparts. And this, again, is an issue that historians are only beginning to really tackle in earnest.
So on this note, we have to bring the session to a close, but allow me just a few announcements. The Good Occupation is available for sale outside this door. I can tell you there is much, much more that could not be covered in a 45-minute talk. The holidays are coming. It's a very readable book, and it should be read by many people. So, outside.
I will be happy to sign it for value added for your uncle, aunt, whoever may be interested to find this in their stocking.
Good. And as you think about your year-end giving plans, you might want to keep the Washington History Seminar in mind. We exist on the generosity of others, so please think about us as you write those checks. We will reconvene next year on Monday, the 23rd of January, with Thomas Blanton and Svetlana Savranskaya speaking on the last Superpower Summit. And finally, please join us for a reception outside these doors. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Professor Carruthers. The first signature before anyone else gets you. So if I could just trouble you right there. Thanks.